Every organisation is vulnerable to insider threats from its employees. Yet, in reality, many organisations fail to put in place measures to protect themselves. We'll be having a wide-ranging panel discussion about how to manage, detect and prevent threats. But first, let's hear from a speaker who's an expert advisor to the United Nations. He's leading a number of applied research projects in resilience and neuropsychology, and has contributed to the development of national and international standards publications in risk management, governance and fraud. Please welcome Executive Director of Risk Resilience and Transformation at Executive Impact Consulting, Dr. Carl A. Gibson. Thank you, Carl.
You are now going to be phenomenally disappointed. Have we got the slide? I've got just two slides, I think, or 3 slides. I'm not going to give a long presentation. I just want to make 2 points. But the slides aren't going to come up, so it doesn't
Just
matter.
going to give you the clicker there.
Okay. Yeah. First thing I want to do, can everybody hear me okay if I don't stand behind the microphone, because I hate microphones and lecterns. First thing I want to do is tell a story. And the second thing I want to do is portray an idea or a suite of ideas for you. The first story is a bit personal. It's about somebody that I knew really, really well. And we'll call him Bill. Bill was a career Air Force from being 16 years of age till the time he took an early retirement from the Air Force. Bill's area of speciality was in the interface between IT systems and operating technology, and in particular on detection of incoming anti-aircraft missiles and the various preventive and reactive systems that aircraft would use to defend themselves. That was his area of speciality. He had one of the highest security classifications that a non-commissioned officer could have in the British Air Force. Bill took an early retirement on medical grounds and went back in as a civilian contractor back into the Air Force, working on Nimrod early warning aircraft systems. So he was on board flying Nimrods, which were used either for anti-submarine patrols or to detect incoming Warsaw Pact aggressors, usually bombers and accompanying fighters. And his speciality then became the detection of these systems, so very highly security classified. He went on then to work on anti-aircraft ground-based systems for protecting airfields, and worked all over the world installing this technology through an American company that contracted him, that, let's say, had a lot of US government interest in that company. So again, very highly classified from a British perspective, very highly classified from a US defence perspective. After a number of years and with a young family, Bill decided he had enough of international travel. And he took on a job as a senior systems engineer for one of the UK's top-selling newspapers when they were opening up a new production facility in London. And Bill was there for a few years, was seen as one of the stars of the place, got the maximum bonus every year, and then things changed. A new management team came in, and in the IT area, the chief technology officer that was one level above him came in, a friend of the new CEO, and things changed for Bill. the culture became highly toxic. Almost every one of his peers left the organisation within a few months of this organisational change. Bill stuck it out. Bill was working a 9-to-5 job. And his boss then decided that Bill's position would have to now become a shift work position. And instead of an 8-hour working day, he was being placed onto a 12-hour working day. Now, if you don't like it, Bill, you can go. There's no retrenchment packages, you just go. So Bill stuck it out for a year. Things changed again, and the shift pattern changed. It meant this time he could no longer catch public transport. With the way the shift changed, he would have to drive in. And Bill lived on the south coast of England, and about a 2.5-hour drive each way, each and every day, to get from home to work. So 5 hours driving in London traffic. Bill's health started to suffer. Bill started to get some mental health problems. He went to see his boss, and his boss said, well, just leave. I don't want you to go. He was bullied. He was certainly, what would now be construed as constructive dismissal over here was practiced against him. And he was the last technical person from the old team to remain. Bill got into a dispute over unpaid bonuses, unpaid overtime payments, unpaid holiday leave, and left. And started to take legal action against the newspaper for all these unpaid monies. And he started to rack up a significant legal bill. So Bill, who was, and I know Bill, known him for many, many years, Bill was incredibly honest, incredible high integrity. He thought I was corrupt. Because I once got out of a speeding ticket when I was in the police. So he thought I was corrupt. Because the person recognised me and said, oh, we'll let it go this time. So the most honest person I've ever known. Bill was now under the care of a psychiatrist. His psychologist had referred him because he needed medication and his mental health was suffering. Bill decided that with the legal bills and with all the unpaid money, he wanted his former employee to pay another way. So Bill contacted the editor-in-chief of a rival newspaper that he knew, and they met in a London hotel, and this is where it begins to start to sound a little bit like a spy story. Bill offered, or made an offer, to the rival editor of the rival newspaper that in the lead up to Christmas, the most profitable time for newspaper advertising, Bill would shut down production of his former employee because he still could access all the production systems and could stop production in such a way that the whole Christmas period would be lost to the rival newspaper. And he turned around to the rival editor and said, I'll do this for you for £500,000, which will fund the life I need. So the editor said, yeah, well, prove it to me, you can do it. So 2 days later, Bill changed the spelling of November and swapped the E and the R around on 2 days. Phoned up the editor-in-chief and said, there, I changed the date on the newspaper. They haven't picked it up. They think it's some other error. I can now stop production. So the editor from the other newspaper turned around and said, right, we'll meet in this hotel, which I forget was either the Hilton or the Hyatt in the centre of London, and I'll give you the cash, and then you bring down the newspaper on Friday. Bill walked into the hotel to pick up his money and was arrested by 4 officers from London Metropolitan Police Special Branch. He was charged with crimes under the Anti-Terrorism Act and was found guilty and got 12 years in the maximum security prison where the IRA terrorists were in prison. Bill was Irish, but he was Irish Protestant, not Irish Catholic, former military, highly dangerous, for him to go into that situation. The lawyers mounted an appeal, and during the appeal he was housed in a different maximum security prison. He won the appeal, sort of, after spending 8 months in the maximum security in solitary isolation, and he got a 2-year sentence in an open prison for corruption-related crimes. They dropped the Counter-Terrorism Act crimes, and he was out in 18 months. The judge described him as a criminal mastermind, which doesn't fit my experience of Bill. Bill was offered all sorts of lucrative employment afterwards, mainly from organised crime gangs, which he of course refused. Bill went on to work in all things in the new self-cleaning toilet technology, setting up all the operating technology and designing new systems for these new wave of toilets that were appearing in London. Then went on to work for local councils. Not even a parking ticket since he came out of prison. Now, Bill would not have been picked up by any pre-employment screening. None of the controls that newspaper had in place would pick up Bill. He was, until there was a change in management, nothing short of an exemplary employee. But Bill's absolute loyalty to his employer changed because of toxic culture and toxic leadership. Things that are exceptionally difficult to put into a set of manuals that you would write on inside a thread. Yet, every person that I know professionally can put up their hands and say, yes, I've worked for a toxic boss, or yes, I've worked in a highly toxic culture, and I've left because of it. Rare is the person that does not experience that. Yet we're trying to manage inside a threat in a culture and with management in a lot of organisations where it matters not what your standard security controls are, because the people that know how to avoid those controls are your current trusted insiders. Now that experience with Bill has been with me for a number of years. Now, originally I was one of the authors of 4811, the very first one that came out, I think 2006, if I remember rightly. And then Jason, who's sat over there, and myself were the two authors of the revised one that came out 2022, 23. Which in itself is interesting. Can I just have a show of hands? How many people in this room are aware of the Australian standard for employment screening? About a third. Yeah. I've got a number of clients that are major organisations. Some are government, some are private sector. Out of 20 of my clients over the last 3 years, only 2 of them were using 4811 for employment screening. Only 3 of them had actually heard of the standard. So we can put out guidance material, but it gets ignored. Individual organisations think they're doing a good job. I have a government client at the moment who said, we've got a great employment screening program in here. It was designed by one of the big 4 companies for us. I won't mention Deloitte's name because it would be embarrassing. Oh, sorry. But I've looked at it and it has 2 out of maybe the 10 key points of areas of action that 4811 recommends. So that's the first thing. We moved away in Standards Australia from talking about 4811 to thinking, well, around that same time, 2006, we brought out a handbook called HB 167, Security Risk Management. People heard of that? Yeah, it's not that great now, very, very dated. So a couple of years ago, Jason and I started to rewrite that handbook. We put it out for peer review earlier this year, and we're in the final stages now of putting consideration of 475 comments from the peer review into the revised handbook. So that will be published sometime towards the end of the year. But because people like Jason and I are manic, we haven't let it rest there. We've decided there's something else we need to be doing. And that's specifically, we thought, and especially in discussion with the Attorney General's Department in Canberra, that we needed to start to look at something on insider risk. And then we decided that, or rather we had an idea, that that's probably not enough. Because you can download off the internet 10, 100, 500 guidance documents. A lot of them are from the cybersecurity space on dealing with insider risks. Some are very physical security oriented, but they're all pretty much the same. They're all perimeter based. They're all around putting up barriers to prevent bad people from doing bad things. But looking at that wealth of information that's out of there, none of that would have helped to manage Bill's case. We wouldn't have stopped Bill doing what Bill did. We wouldn't have easily detected what Bill did. And we wouldn't have had a good response to what Bill did if we'd relied on traditional insider threat. Which brings me to the idea. And you'll have heard of trusted insider, but this is very much around looking holistically at how we treat people in organisations and how we can have early interventions before the traditional security hand on the shoulder, you're nicked approach if somebody does something wrong. Now, in this room, you won't be able to read this. Whoops, how do I go back? But that's a mind map overview of those points. And that's an overview of a new handbook for trusted insider management that Australian Standards has started work on. There is a proposal document which will go up onto their website in the next few weeks, which outlines in detail in text this map of areas we're looking at. Seeking public comment, so I urge you to come back to Standards Australia with that comment, and a working group will then be formed to develop this. Now, I have a personal interest. Although I'm ex-police and ex-army, I'm not what I would call a security professional. My actual real background is in neuropathology. That's where the doctor comes in. I'm actually a neuropathologist by training. So because I'm writing the proposal with Jason, it's got a hell of a lot of psychology in it around behaviours of people in normal environments. And part of the emphasis of this is not an original idea, it's an idea we have stolen from occupational health and safety. And traditional occupational safety, which is now called Safety 1, has matured in recent years. So there's a whole new area called Safety 2 and 2.0. So we're calling something Security 2.0 now, the basis of the philosophy underlying this. And that is that instead of trying to prevent the bad things from happening and only focusing on that, we need to start focusing on how we better make sure that the right things and success happens. So a different philosophy. I'm sure we'll pick some of this up in the panel session. And I'll stand down, and then I'll be back for the panel.
Thank you so much, Carl. How about a round of applause? That was a wonderful example of storytelling, making a multitude of points. All right, joining us now on stage are two other experts in this field. Nick de Bont became the Chief Security Officer for Thales Australia in 2019. In this role, he manages all aspects of security and compliance, including the protection of manufacturing facilities, large naval, air and land contracts, and high-level technology projects. Nick currently holds the position of Deputy Chair of the Forum of Australian Security Executives. Please make him welcome. And Gillian Claxton is a highly sought-after security professional with more than 3 decades of counter-espionage, investigation and behavioural intelligence experience. He's the founder of Jade Consulting, recognised as Australia's premier provider of specialised technical surveillance countermeasure and insider threat management services. Please put your hands together. Thank you all so much. It's a privilege to sit with so many experts on the stage, so let's get right into it. Nick, my first question is for you. How significant an impact can an insider threat, whether intentional or unintentional, have on an organisation?
Thanks, Tracy. So the reality is there's some really big insider cases we're all familiar with, like the Edward Snowden case and inadvertent trades like UBS, where you've lost a couple of $1 billion. But almost every organisation I know hides the impact from an insider. So no one wants to publicise that their IP has been stolen, that leaks to the media have come from trusted staff, that they've lost business because of an insider attack. So we'll never really understand, but from a security practitioner perspective, every single person I've ever talked to rates that, and as Lindsay's slide showed, that was the third highest risk, insider, and cybersecurity at the top. And we've got to remember we have both the intentional insiders and the inadvertent insiders, those that accidentally leave that laptop on the plane, or in the military's case, leave the confidential report in the Qantas Club photocopier or something similar. So it is a prevalent problem, and we know that is because humans make mistakes, and they make mistakes on purpose or inadvertently, and that will always continue. So it's a problem that will never go away, regardless of technology changes. So it is a big one, Tracy.
What's your sense? Is it predominantly intentional or unintentional?
I would say the vast majority is unintentional, particularly when you look at cyber attacks, accidentally being lazy, complacency. We see that all the time. The more purposeful attacks are harder to detect. So we're certain that occurs regularly, that we never pick up. I mean, if we look at spy agencies around the world, if they weren't successful at their job, we would always see those attacks. So, but inadvertent ones, particularly in the cyberspace, are a major problem.
Gillian, what behaviours or indicators are more likely to be associated with the people who commit these kind of insider attacks?
There are a myriad behaviours that we have to be across. But the thing that we teach our clients and work on in this field is looking for changes to people's behaviour. So there's the usual list of issues or indicators such as unexplained wealth or anger within the workplace, not following rules, looking at trying to access areas, whether it be through data or physically access areas they shouldn't be in, all of which most of us are across and most of us are aware of. But what we've got to be across here and conscious of is when somebody's behaviour changes, what are those indicators that are different from the norm? And it's a challenging environment because every personality is different. Everyone has a different persona at different times depending on what they're doing and where they are. And the trick is to understand what the person's normal behaviour looks like versus what has changed in that demeanour or the way they operate. As I say, there's the top 6. I mean, disgruntlement, which is very much in line with what Carl mentioned, is probably at the top, where people start complaining. They don't follow rules. They become rude to other staff members. Anger and so on and so forth are all very, very common indicators. But again, I think the key is to look at where those changes occur and learn to recognise behavioural changes that could be indicative of malicious intent.
The signs.
Can I just jump in on that? Absolutely agree with what Julian said. But there's another group of insiders which present a huge risk to the organisation, where it's not the change in behaviour, but the consistency in behaviour. Can I just do a quick poll? Because it's all well and good the four of us doing all the work. We want you to do some work as well. How many of you have got a psychopath in your organisation? Actually, on average, you should all be putting up your hands. Criminal psychopaths represent about 4% of the population. And they generally get caught because they're not very bright. And so 70, 80% of a prison population are criminal psychopaths. There's another group of psychopaths which, when they were around about 7 or 8, didn't have traumatic experiences. And their brains continue to develop well. And they become corporate psychopaths. Public sector, private sector, there's not a lot of difference. But the surveys that have been done, the published research suggests that 30 to 40% of senior management in an organisation are clinical psychopaths. Machiavellian behaviour, manipulative, claiming credit for what others do for yourselves, blaming your mistakes on others are all typical indicators. Narcissistic behaviour and toxic behaviour forms what we call the psychopath triangle. I've worked for maybe 11 corporate psychopaths in my career and have been wounded by them in each and every case. Corporate psychopaths probably are responsible for revenue loss and profit loss 4 to 10 times what any other insider group is doing, because they are working the system for their own benefit. So that's consistent behaviour, not behavioural change. So and this is this idea I was talking about. We need to look at how organisations manage psychopaths in the organisation, but because they are so manipulative, because they are so narcissistic, and because they are so able to manipulate their own charisma, they tend to rise more quickly in an organisation than people that do their job. And I can see a few nodding heads with individuals in here that have had psychopaths as bosses. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Let's move on to background checks and vetting then. You mentioned that in your presentation, Carl. Julian, are they of much use, those kind of checks for employees and contractors?
Absolutely fundamental, but they can't see the future. So background checks are critical within organisations to understand who it is that you're letting in the front door. You need to ensure as best as possible and within the means available, and it's difficult in Australia because of privacy laws and other protections that are afforded to every individual. But you need to have at least a baseline understanding of whether a person's got a track history of criminal activity, financial stress or otherwise, and it is critical that you undertake background checks. However, the process has got to be dynamic. It is not a point in time. And I think a lot of organisations that we've seen out there assume that because they've gone through rigorous checks, and the government is a classic example here with security clearances that various people hold for access to different levels of information. But unfortunately, that doesn't predict what's going to occur down the track. And I mean, cliched statement nowadays, but Edward Snowden is a classic example of that. Cleared to the highest level. But nobody knew that his interests, his passions changed, his ideologies shifted over a period of time. And whilst I understand that there were indicators that suggested that he was on that what we call critical pathway to insider risk, unfortunately they were overlooked. That dynamic approach to background checks is fundamental.
Aside from vetting, Nick, what kind of policies and procedures can help mitigate risk of insider threats?
Oh, I love policies and procedures. A short one. Look, there are lots of policies and procedures that cover insiders, from your data loss prevention to your access control and management. But I find far and away the easiest one that everyone should have is your departure checklist for staff. Like, if you look at all the studies, the highest risk of somebody really taking the crown jewels occurs in about the 90 days before they depart the organisation. So having a risk-based approach for staff departures where, if someone's got the crown jewels, they're the IT administrator for your global cloud system. When you exit them from the company, you want to make sure that that is a clean and quick exit. Gardening leave is fine. And then if it's the payroll person who's only got access to one system that dials in from India, it's a less of a concern. So you have to have a varied exit procedure, but a lot of large companies have got really complex insider programs, but even a small company can have a planned process for when key staff leave or indicate they're going to leave and putting some protections in place. And it's as simple as, from a practical perspective, maybe you've got 24-hour access to the office building. I'm going to reduce that now to 9 to 5 in the few weeks before you go. You had USB access because you're a sales guy. I'm just cutting it off for your last month. So there's some practical and easy things that you can do to reduce that risk for that staff member. No longer can you dial in on the VPN. You got to come to the office. I'm cutting your VPN. I'm switching off your printer, etc. And if they know that's the policy, no one's going to get upset about it because they know beforehand that's the standard process. And if you're in a ruthless company where 5% of the staff are sacked every year, which some financial companies are, then that's an immediately, hey, thanks very much, you're coming with me. I'm walking you out of the building. I've cut off your access already. I'll send your locker in the post. Because in a ruthless company, the staff are more ruthless, and you need to be more ruthless with your exit procedures.
Carl, do you love policies and procedures? And if so, what are the ones that stand out for you that actually work?
You can ask Nick if I love them or not.
He loves them.
Given the fact he's had quite a few of my reports in the past about policies and procedures. Policies and procedures are great up to the point that a human interacts with them. Sorry, up to the point where a human interacts with them. There's a well-known theory on deviancy that was developed by, and I forget her name, first name was Deborah, and I've forgotten her surname now. She did a whole review on the Challenger shuttle crash and looked at deviancy in NASA. But what she found was equally appropriate to security policies and procedures as it is to any policy and procedure. And that is that policies and procedures represent a thing that we call work as imagined. That's what we believe is happening. There's then what the managers for those responsible areas tell us is happening, or they tell auditors during security control reviews what is happening, and that's work as reported. Then there's what people actually do, which is work as done. And there's usually massive gaps, especially between work as imagined, the policy and the procedure, and work as done, the actual practice. And that's because a very fundamental aspect of human psychology is that we want to make things easy. We want to make things easy for ourselves. We want to make things easy in our professional lives so we can actually get more done in a day. So we tend to take shortcuts. And when we do a shortcut and it works, we get a reward in our brain and we get dopamine released, which reinforces that shortcut for the next time we want to take it. And eventually taking that shortcut becomes normalized. Then when we take somebody and we teach them how to do the policy and procedure, we teach them the shortcut. And so that shortcut spreads through the organization for those that are following that policy and procedure. And we know from hundreds, if not thousands of case studies, this happens in every single organization over time. It's called normalization of deviance. So yeah, I love policies and procedures, right up until a human gets involved with them. And then we have to look at the person.
Well, they're just one aspect, aren't they? Because overarching all of that is culture. Julian, how do we instill a culture of vigilance within organisations?
This is one of my favourite topics in the field of insider risk. Culture is a driver of all activity, positive and negative, within organisations. And the best way to instill a positive culture is to communicate and educate. And I've got it in all my material. Educate, educate, educate. People want to have to work in the organisation. And if we use Carl's brilliant example of Bill, who was a model employee that thought Carl was corrupt. Incidentally, I'm concerned sitting on the stage with a man who's admitted to using his power to get out of a speeding ticket. Anyway, that's reputation. That's another topic.
I was young. It was...
Youthful indiscretion, they call it.
It betrays my age now, but it was nearly 40 years ago.
Goodness gracious. There you go. However, back to the point. Understanding how people think within organisation enables you to then model and drive the organisation in a positive manner. And so instilling a positive culture is about educating people on what works and what doesn't work. And from our experience and my own research, it's also about why it doesn't work and why it does work, whether it's a policy and procedure, whether it's a promotional policy that talks about who gets elevated to the next role and what have you. But culture is critical. Everybody in this room, I'm quite sure, would have a story of disgruntlement, whether it's been themselves within their workplace or people that have been working for them, above them or alongside them. Everyone's had a story to tell about somebody who was disgruntled. Their performance will drop. Their commitment to the organisation will be significantly less subject to the disgruntlement, whether it be that they've been overlooked for a promotion. And these are all indicators that lead on that critical pathway that we need to be across. So promoting a positive culture is about teaching people the hows and whys of what works, why it's beneficial for everybody, and maintaining a cohesive approach.
What I'm hearing is it's a multifaceted approach. And Nick, part of that is tools and technologies to monitor insider threats. What are some of the best of those?
So I guess it depends on your business model, whether you're running a factory, a distribution centre, or an office block, etc. But there's such a myriad. It also depends on the complexity of your company. But I'd be looking at what are your primary risks that you're concerned about. I can give you an easy example is in the banking industry. It's been relatively common, unfortunately, for tellers to take money from elderly people's accounts who aren't going to notice. And so monitoring your staff's bank activities and those of elderly people with a term deposit that doesn't have a lot of transactions, that's an example of a specific control that works for that particular industry that's not necessarily going to work for everybody else. But from a technology perspective, all of us are moving to using the cloud or using computers for all aspects of our business. And really it's key to try and reduce the ability for an insider to either inadvertently or on purpose transfer data. So closing your USB ports, forcing them onto email, which is easier to monitor, reducing access to cloud storage that's off your network and VPN, those sort of things from a cyber perspective are really important. And the other one, which is not talked about too much, is kind of been hinted in Carl's presentation and Julian's, is just your general staff welfare measurements. How are we going from a staff perspective? So those surveys that are a bit painful but are important. And if you get a survey that says 35% of your workforce considers leaving every 12 months, that's a pretty clear warning sign that you need to work on that part of the business with HR. And the best insider programs I've seen are those where it's not the hand on the shoulder from security, it's a joint meeting with security, HR, and they actually have the powers to advance you a paycheck because you're actually in financial distress and you disclose that, to give you actual additional annual leave. So they're actually like a welfare team, and they reduce that risk right at the offset, but they've got the power to do that. And it's really hard to have, is the ability to go, actually, you need a break, mate. Here, take an extra week of leave.
That also speaks to the importance of relationships. You mentioned bank tellers. Carl, are there any particular general areas in organisations that are more prone to insider threats and risk?
Yes. I'd look at that from two aspects. The area you know least about the risk profile and you know least about the vulnerabilities is probably the highest risk area you need to go and look at. And where your most trusted individuals are, that if they did something wrong intentionally or unintentionally, can cause the most harm. Apart from that, there's the obvious things around people that have certain levels of system access, etc. But it's really looking at what the risk profile is. And I'm not a huge person for standard risk assessments. I think standard risk assessments are an oversimplified and abstract view of a very complex environment. And we need to think about risk from multiple different aspects, not just plugging into a risk matrix, a consequence and a likelihood and saying that's our high risk. There's lots of nuances that a good risk professional looks at. What we found in doing the survey for things like the Security Risk Management Handbook, the research for that, is that a vast majority of security professionals have a very basic understanding of risk and how to do a risk assessment. And we need to educate them.
I'll be opening this for questions in a moment, so have a think about what you'd like to ask. I promise it'll be very soon. Nick, you were going to say something there?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things I see sometimes is people believe that it doesn't affect those individuals who are right up the top of the tree. There's a really good example that's going through the courts right now with Commonwealth Bank, which I was involved in, where was this very senior IT executive on about $600,000 or $700,000 a year, who engaged directly with a vendor to set up some false invoices to get paid $1 million. And it was just a really eye-opening for me. I just thought someone at that kind of financial income wouldn't be so motivated for a measly $1 million. I mean, he can earn more than that in 2 years. But it's important to note that it can impact all workers at all levels, regardless of income.
If I may, I'd like to just add a couple of points at both ends here. Not everyone is interested in money, to your point. It's often ideology. It could be motivated via coercion. It could be motivated via ego. There are, a multitude of different reasons that people may undertake an insider threat act. The other thing that I just want to touch on to answer your question about whether there's any particular sector that might be more targeted or more appealing for insider threat interests. Whilst I thoroughly agree with Carl's response to that, I'm also of the opinion that any organisation at any level, small or large, 2-person company versus a 20,000-person company and so on, if they hold any information or they have money or they have influence, power, they're likely to become a target of insider threat interests. And the other thing to be mindful of, and I think for our audience today, this is really important, every single one of the people in this room probably have more access to the organisation's information that they work for than anyone else is ever likely to. And therefore, the people in this room are probably the most likely insider threat actors. I say that with absolute respect. So let's also think about not just what sectors might be targeted, but let's also go back to that human factor and think about who has access to the information, the money or the power.
Gee, the behavioural aspects are fascinating. I can see questions coming in and I saw a hand shooting up
Tracy,
before.
just before you do, there's
get to
one thing
questions
we
in a
haven't
moment.
talked about in that. It follows on from both Nick's and Julian's comments. Let's talk about sex. 3 of the most high-profile cases I've investigated were all sex-based. One was a CEO that was effectively embezzling with travel and hotel because he was taking his mistress, who was a department head, with him on every overseas trip flying first class and staying at 5-star hotels for prolonged periods of time when he was going for a single day's meeting. A CFO that was exploiting his position to promote juniors for sex, and a deputy CEO that was having an affair with the chief financial officer, and together they embezzled direct money from accounts where he was signing off on all of the payroll expenditures, and they ghosted 5, 6 senior executives on the payroll accounts.
Gosh, it really is the 7 deadly sins, isn't it, that drives this behaviour. Someone put their hand up before. Thank you very much, Brenda. And then I'll go to the question on here, which is also excellent.
Thank you very much. If you were to prioritise investment in regard to insider threat, would you invest in audit and monitoring tools or would you invest in better vetting and ongoing employee management solution? So basically, would you invest upstream or downstream?
Who'd like to take that, Nick?
I'm happy to kick it off. It is a really difficult question to answer because it's subject to the context. It depends on your environment, it depends on the nature of the business that you're involved in, it depends on the people that you have in your organisation. But the one thing that we promote, and I haven't had an opportunity to slip this concept in, but any insider threat is people-centric. It never happens automatically. Somebody initiates it, whether it be utilising a cyber vector or an embezzlement financially or opening a door to access information. It comes back to the human factor. So if you're going to invest in understanding people. I talk about learning to identify deception within the workforce, because at every stage of espionage, the chain of espionage, fraud, there is going to be some sort of indicator exhibited by a human that will reveal the anomalous behaviour that you need to be aware of, back to those indicators. However, that doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't invest in technology. But again, that technology is monitoring the activity of human behaviour, if that makes sense.
Nick, would you concur?
Yeah, look, it's really difficult depending on the individual circumstances. I mean, my personal viewpoint is the initial vetting is a non-negotiable, simply because it will bring massive reputational damage if you just hired the ex-mafia lord or something similar, regardless of your company. And we've seen some great examples of really big companies in Australia that have hired CEOs, chief research officers, who have completely made up their entire resumes. And that is pretty low cost, a lot of different vendors providing a variety of services. And then you could restrict access. So, you know, depending on the business model, you might have 300 employees, but only 20 of them have access to a particular IP on your server, and you lock that down, even if it's a cheap control. So I would always try and have a balance, and even when you've got limited funding, even if you're using the built-in Microsoft encryption, that is better than nothing. And there are a range of free tools. Cyber is really a great community that shares a whole bunch of free tools for monitoring, etc. Those free tools are highly capable. So even when you have a limited budget, you can usually cover off on both areas.
Terrific. I'll go to this online question and then go back to the audience. So if you want to shoot your hand up now, Brenda, I'll get the microphone to you early. This question's for Julian. And the questioner writes, I'd like to hear more detail and some examples, if possible, of what dynamic employee screening looks like, and are there employment relation, for example, fair work considerations?
So I'm going to start this off a little bit left of field here. Mental health is fundamental and privacy is equally important. So whatever controls one looks at taking, you've got to be very, very conscious of both of those issues. But the reality is, when you're looking at dynamic screening, it's about a person's interest. It's about the comments that they make within the workforce. And this comes back to my view on the fact that employees are going to be your best eyes and ears to identify some of the concerns within an organisation. But that dynamic monitoring means periodically checking the interests of employees who have access to critical information. And it's very difficult when you're talking about a 10,000 employee organisation, or 1,000, or for a small business, 100 perhaps. But you've got to be very selective in the manner in which you undertake it. Checking financial records to ensure that there's no bankruptcies, checking that there's no court records in those jurisdictions where you're allowed to do it, but doing it dynamically. Similarly to the government, in the way that they do their background checks for vetting for access to classified information, they do it periodically. I don't necessarily agree with the methodology in its entirety, but it's a great platform to launch from. And I think looking at social media, for example, is really important. Understanding what groups, what interests a person might have taken upon, whether it be they're out playing Dungeons and Dragons on the weekend that might turn into something else, or whether they're mixing with a motorcycle group that actually somebody happened to pick, they're wearing colours or a patch or something along those lines. So that dynamic approach is very much about consistently validating different sources or streams of information. Social media is critical in that respect, But the other, again, and I'm harping on this a little, but it's also listening to your employees, listening to those people who work with one another, where somebody says, something's just not quite right about Fred today, and that might be the flag to launch a more proactive approach for that dynamic checking.
It's such good guidance. It reminds me of that expression, listening's more important than talking. You've got two ears and one mouth.
So I'll stop.
No, not at all. Who would like to ask a question from the audience? We have time for probably one or two more questions. So please shoot your hand up or I'll ask one of my questions and be terribly selfish up here. I guess this is a bit of a flow on from what we've been talking about, particularly around the fair work consideration. Carl, how do you balance security needs with employee rights and ethical considerations?
That's a terrible question.
That's why I gave it to you. You're such a good talker.
Yeah, I've got to have time to think. That's hugely difficult. Nick hit upon it in a certain way when he was talking about this collaborative effort between human resources and security. And one of the biggest issues is this area of personal privacy. And in my experience, HR professionals and safety professionals do not like to share information with the security team. It's this need to know concept. Especially if it's relating to mental health issues, the security team is often the last to find out. When I headed up both for a university, I headed up, amongst many other things, both security and safety, and we missed a serial killer or a mass murderer in training. We didn't catch them until their first attack. It was a female, and she tried to stab to death. She'd fantasized for months and had posted on social media around fantasizing killing somebody. And in the university library, at about lunchtime, she followed a girl into the toilets, stabbed her 27 times. The victim lost her spleen but survived with all the other multiple injuries. But there was a pattern of behaviour that was detected by student counselling for the year before the attack. And student counselling didn't share it with anyone because it was private, personal, private and medical around mental health. And so they sat on the indicators for 12 months. So this is a hugely difficult, I don't know any organisation that's got the balance right. Because there is a level that you want to, when you go as an employee to work, you don't want to think that Big Brother is watching you. And that's even to the concept that everybody knows where the out in the open cameras are. But hidden cameras in sprinkler systems or what have you, when that's released, that was for somebody's personal protection, the employees are outraged that there was any covert surveillance going on. Even though it's happened in this case to save a female from sexual harassment, the other female employees were outraged that there was a hidden camera in a corridor outside the victim's office. Hugely difficult. I haven't got an answer. It depends on the organisational culture. I think it's easier in a culture which has a positive leadership where there's trust in the organisation, that the organisation will do the right thing, and that things are done for the best of intentions. In an organisation where there's less trust, where people feel as though they're being micromanaged, they're being or there's a toxic environment, then that balance shifts completely the other way. So what's unacceptable maybe in Talis would be completely unacceptable, say, in Woolworths, where there's a different level of trust.
Gee, it really sounds like with everything it comes down to the all-important culture.
Yeah.
This is a complex area. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I hope you all have too. Thank you for your thought-provoking questions. Please thank Nick, Julian and Carl.